Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. I'm Josh Mailman. I'm patient advocate and president of NorCal Carcinet Community. I'd like to welcome you today a little bit to discuss clinical trials, the why, the what, and the how. Now, as a patient advocate, I've been working with clinical trials for many years now. I was a member of the Gallium-68 working group, which set up a guideline for how to do investigational trials with Gallium-68 before it was approved back in 2012. I was a member of the NCI Neuroendocrine Tumor Task Force, the GI Steering Committee. I currently serve as the co-chair of the Patient Advocate Steering Committee for the National Cancer Institute. I serve as an FDA patient representative. I'm a member of the American Society of Clinical Oncology Research Committee. And lastly, I teach methods in clinical cancer research as a patient advocate on how new investigators should learn how to work with patients in clinical trials, mostly early design, phase 1, phase 2, and we'll talk about what that means. More recently, early in May, this article on patient advocates and research partners in cancer research, a winning combination, was published by the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And if you have your camera and want to click on that little crazy looking thing down in the right-hand corner, you'll be able to actually get the full abstract of how patient advocates can work with researchers in clinical trials. So with that, let's start. Now, why a patient advocate should work in clinical trials, just a little background. Doctors look from the top down and they are excited about what they're doing, they're interested in survival, and us as patients might look at the same thing a little differently than our doctors do. And we might be, and as some of these studies have shown, more interested in enhanced quality of life, that's what QOL means, and other aspects, and be more concerned about things in a clinical trial. And we'll get to that as well. And I just wanted to show kind of the world of patient advocacy, that research advocacy is a little different, but it's part of the process of being for some patient advocates as well. Looking forward, I do want to give you my conflict of interest. You can see all the people who support us there on the right. Those are people who donate and or contribute to the various things we run throughout the year. No sponsor has actually seen or had any input on this. While I do work in various different aspects of clinical trial design, these views are my own, and honestly, I'm a patient advocate. I'm not a doctor. Please work with your medical team, regardless of what you see here. Please work with them and make sure that you run anything you plan to do by them or with them as part of your medical team. So I could spend the better part of the entire conference today talking about clinical trials. So I wanted to know a little bit about what you wanted to learn and where you were there. And these are the questions that came out of that Zoom session. You know, are there different types of trials? How do trials get designed? How should I find a clinical trial? What questions should I ask? And how many of those who were participating had done a clinical trial or were part of it? We get about what is average for those who are being treated for cancer. About 8% are in a clinical trial, 92% haven't yet entered into one. And I'll argue that it would be really great to see if we can increase that percentage of participation, not only for NETS patients, but across every type of trial, so that we can get more answers and move the art forward. So mostly today I'm going to talk about interventional clinical trials, and these are the phases that we'll talk about. But I want to make you aware that there are other types of trials. So we talk about an interventional trial, and you see the different phases on the left. We also have observational studies, which are population-based over time to understand a bit about diseases. And I'm actually co-PI or principal investigator of something that was funded by PCORI called NetPro with the University of Iowa, that looks over observational over a period of time on different treatments that we go through and different lifestyle choices. And if you want to be involved in that trial, there's another little QR code that you can put your camera on right there to be involved in it. It's a very large study. There's no treatment, and that's the really big difference between interventional trials and observational trials. Clinical trials that are interventional coming in 4 phases and maybe a pre-phase 1, which is called preclinical trial. And we'll really only talk about these 4 phases here. Phase 1 is known as safety or dose escalation. These can be done with healthy volunteers or those who have a particular disease. This is to find what it's sometimes called max tolerated doses, what the maximum dose that seems to be safe can be done. Phase 2 will try to hone in on what that exact dosage is, and that's a phase 2 trial. Neither phase 1 and mostly not phase 2 are randomized. If you're on, they're called not blinded or open label, where you as the participant will know the drug that you're getting. Phase 1 is not one that we know anything about the efficacy or how well the drug will work. When we're getting to phase 2, we're trying to start seeing what the right dosage might be and a little bit about its efficacy, but still we're not exactly sure how well it will work. Phase 3, again, looks at safety, but this time we want to know how well it works, and usually how well it works against a standard of care. And we'll talk about that a little bit in some of your other questions as well. But this is a trial that's usually randomized, with one set of participants getting the experimental or new treatment or new combination, and the other arm getting the standard of care or control. And they may be a one-to-one randomization, but they may have different randomization schemes to make sure that we might be able to recruit. And phase 4, which is often something we don't talk about all that much, is post-approval. So phase 3 is sometimes called a registration trial, because that's the type of information you need to get a drug approved for the FDA or other governmental agencies. But they might require further study, and that further study is in something called phase 4. And mostly we talk about enrolling in phase 2 and phase 3, but both phase 1 and phase 4 can be enrolled in as well. So who designs a trial? There's 3 main actors in this area: pharmaceutical companies, which is where we think most of the trials come from, but that's not necessarily true. It may be true for a registration trial, bringing new drugs onto the market that need a sponsor. Some of these people are called sponsors. And pharmaceutical companies certainly are one aspect of clinical trials, and who sponsors it. The National Cancer Institute or members of the various cooperative groups, and you can see the various cooperative groups that are in those big blue circles there. These are groups of research centers and affiliated centers that may offer a trial, and they can do it as a single member of a cooperative group, or as the entire NCI, National Cancer Institute, can help coordinate across all the cooperative groups. And we can even have trials that are brought to us by individual investigators or institutions. And most of us are familiar with gallium-68. This is a trial. Many of the early gallium-68 DOTA-TOC and DOTA-TATE trials were actually funded by the individual institution, because there was no drug sponsor in the beginning of when those things were brought to market, which makes it a little bit more complicated, but we want to thank those individual institutions for doing it. As I said, I work with the NCI and I work with other patient advocates in training them how to review clinical trials. Clinical trials, by the time they get to you, have gone through a lot of scrutiny. The part I work with in the NCI is just looking at the single concept review, and this goes through the whole life cycle of what a clinical trial might go through to get to approval, to get to opening the trial, and to get to review. So even just the small aspect of what I do at the NCI, which is review trials, to not evaluate the entire protocol, but just to see whether the concept makes sense, is just one small aspect of it. And that's, wanted to show you a little bit more. A concept is like 10 pages, which is what I do and what I work with other advocates and how to review. While a protocol, the thing that you actually get before you actually enter into a clinical trial is a 150-page document that has gone over with reviews, design, eligibility, and also gone through many steps at the institution to get out to you to enroll in. So it's a rather lengthy process, and has many steps in review throughout the life cycle. So when should I be looking for a trial? And when did your medical team first discuss clinical trials as part of your treatment? The worrisome thing here is that 54% have never had this been discussed. We often think of clinical trials as the last hope. That was one of the words of why I'm looking for a clinical trial. It isn't just for the last hope, there's no other treatment option. It can be used to figure out where there might be new treatment options that might replace current first-line treatments as well. We have 2 trials that are open right now in somatostatin analogs, for instance, that are both at time of diagnosis. And it's not because you can't take a certain drug or there's no option for you. It's because these might actually be improvements to be easier to take or be more efficacious than what we currently offer for first line. So unless you learned about them early, you wouldn't be able to enroll in them because they really are for people to diagnose in the first 6 months. So I think you should always be looking at clinical trials and discussing them, and to see if you fit a profile that might help us contribute to science, as someone put it here, and might be beneficial and might actually really move the art forward for future patients as well. And I find it interesting that most of us have heard about clinical trials first from patients and support groups. So congratulations, and keep that up. What hampers participation? Well, these are some of the things that are out there. Again, only 8% have actually enrolled in a clinical trial, and some of this is because people are afraid of being in placebo, or that it's risky, and that I might be in the control group. And what I want to say to that is that most registration trials and most phase 3 trials, especially in our disease where there are so many different options to go for, really don't have a control group that isn't an active arm. Placebos are inactive. We like to make sure that they are part of standard of care. And so it's very unlikely, matter of fact, I haven't seen one in a good time in the United States, that is a placebo-controlled trial. We also, as part of what we do in that review that we've talked about, is make sure that every trial has equipoise, which is a fancy word for making sure that both sides are equal, that there's uncertainty, that we don't know the answer between the 2 sides. And that's why we do the trials, so that we can improve our knowledge and make sure that we understand which are better options, so that we can move forward with the right options in the future. Expense and safety and risk information should be well detailed in your informed consent, and I just want to make sure when you get your trial documentation that you always look through the informed consent. I work with a lot of investigators to make sure that those informed consent discuss what the safety of that combination would be, what you're actually going to have to pay, if you have to pay anything for standard of care or parking, or how you can get those things. And it is okay to ask for very detailed what that expense will be. Can you get that covered? Will the investigator cover it? So how do you find a clinical trial? I mean, at the end of the day, the old way was we went to somewhere called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a repository of every phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, anything that is in there for the public. And pretty much worldwide, I believe 92 or 94% of all actual treatment interventions are done inside clinicaltrials.gov. But it's not the easiest way to go. This is the old way. It is not an easy way to really understand and look for it. It has some anomalies, especially for neuroendocrine tumor patients. where every melanoma trial in the world has been tagged as a neuroendocrine tumor trial, which makes it harder to do. And there's a new way, and I'd like to introduce you to something I worked on a good amount last year, which is called an AI version of looking for clinical trials. And we did it with an expert panel to make sure that it was specific to neuroendocrine tumors and went through an actual interview, and like to show the brand new branded LACNETS clinical trials net finder. And very straightforward, you put your location, and here I'm putting Los Angeles, and you just click on next, and we can help find the trial for you. You put where your primary is, what your grade is, and what is going on currently. It goes through every inclusion and exclusion. The interview will take about a little less than 5 minutes. You can use your Net Vitals to help fill this out and to understand what goes into this. And then it will turn and look at the trials that we think might be right for you and list them off to you with order of how relevant they may be. And you can take a look at this, and you'll notice there's a couple of different things that you see up here. You can click on the export button and export an Excel spreadsheet that will show all the names of the clinical trials and where they're being offered and what phase they are, so you can take them to your physician. You will get a full description of it. There's even farther what drugs are involved and how to actually be put in contact with that clinical trial. And this is something that is live and available on the LACNET site, but you can point your phone right at this QR code and get that as well. In trying to sum this up to give you an idea of why you should be interested, how these things go about, and tools to help you find more clinical trials that are right for you. And with that, I'll turn it back to our hosts.